Hello, and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, the author of the novel Brotherless Night.
We had a crossover episode that we aired last week that we actually recorded before the new year. This is our first time to talk since 2026 began. It's not been a good year so far for your hometown of Minneapolis.
That's right. As most of our listeners probably already know, I live in South Minneapolis. ICE is in my neighborhood and all over the Twin Cities every day. At this point, we're taping this episode on Monday, January 12th. And 5 days ago in South Minneapolis, an ICE officer murdered a poet, a woman who was acting as a legal observer. And there have been vigils and protests every day since then. So I want to just start this episode by mourning and honoring her and acknowledging the deep grief around all the ICE-related casualties and violence so far. I also just really wanted to thank the incredible people who have come out every day in solidarity to patrol, to protest, to protect our community, and to say that we want ICE out of Minnesota and that we value and welcome immigrants and stand in solidarity with our neighbors, and that the state-sponsored terror, which is what it is, must end. So just to our listeners, if you can call your representatives to say this, it would mean a lot. And we'll have more to say about that situation in our next episode.
Thanks, Sugi. For today, we're joined by two old friends here to address another big question about our futures, artificial intelligence. First, Vauhini Vara is back to talk about her recent essay for The New Yorker, What If Readers Like AI-Generated Fiction? Vauhini was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize, and the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize for her novel, The Immortal King Rao. Her story collection, This Is Salvage, was longlisted for the Story Prize and the Mark Twain American Voice in Literature Award. She is also the author of an acclaimed nonfiction book, Searches, Selfhood in the Digital Age. Vauhini, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And we're also excited to have Karan Mahajan with us for the first time. Karan grew up in New Delhi, India, and moved to the US for college. His first novel, Family Planning, was a finalist for the Dylan Thomas Prize. His second novel, The Association of Small Bombs, was a finalist for the National Book Award and was named one of the 10 best books of 2016 by the New York Times. In 2017, he was named one of Granta's best young American novelists. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The New York Review of Books, The New Republic, and others. A former fellow at the Cullman Center for Writers and Scholars, he teaches at Brown. His third novel, The Complex, will be published in March. Karan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to see you guys.
So I'm getting a huge kick out of the fact that you guys are on together. And Vauhini, you quote Karan in this article. So I thought maybe you could just start off by telling our listeners how you met and a little bit about your literary and friend circle from college, which is somewhat unusual.
Yeah, I'll start and then Karan, you fill in what I missed. I remember being on my bike outside the Stanford Daily where I worked in college, and this like writer acquaintance at the time, Jenny, came up on her bike and was like, "Hey, do you have a minute?" I was like, "Yeah, sure. I just, I've got like 5 minutes before I have to go work on the paper again." And she was like, "Well, don't tell anyone, but a couple of us are starting a really exclusive top secret writing group for only the best writers at Stanford." And I was like, "Ooh, who's in it?" And she was like, "Well, it's me, Max Doty, Karan Mahajan." Who else, Karan? Was Anna North, Alice Kim, Anthony Ha. All of whom, so we all started writing together in this writing group and became really close friends and have kind of been like writing and sharing work for the 20 plus years since. And all of us have gone on to be writers in the world. We've all ended up doing that as our professions, which is really cool.
Vauhini, you didn't mention Tony, who was brought in later by Alice Kim. And also, I just want to preface, though this sounds like a top secret, pretentious writing group, Jenny, who invited me, had never read my writing. She just had a vibe that like...
She never read my writing either.
Yeah, she was like, "I just think you're a good writer, probably." So... but I will say, like, Vauhini and I, we've been exchanging work for over 20 years at this point. And also like all of us became the closest of friends as well. Like it was like kind of a magical thing that happened. And um, we've all primarily remained fiction writers. I mean, we do other kinds of writing too, especially Vauhini, who has like obviously a very, very vast nonfiction practice. But yeah, so in short, I should be the kind of person who can recognize Vauhini's writing without destroying her ego in the process.
Do you think we're going to
And
talk
yet,
about this recognizing, writing, everything? But I just had this thought while you guys were talking about meeting, like, so do you think like in 10 years, like LLMs will say like, well, I met so-and-so LLM that one time, and I remember it was in like
no,
2027.
Whitney. That's the worst. No, that will never, we're going to not let that happen.
I think that can happen. Why can't that happen?
No,
It'll
I'm
happen.
also howl of despair at this.
They can have, okay, I think there will be friendships. Anyway, let's talk about this friendship. You've been reading each other's work for 2 decades. Wahini, you've been writing and reporting on AI for several years, and you've been talked with us about it on this show before. So your essay in the New Yorker that we brought you here to talk about begins with research from a scientist named, oh, here I'm going to make a mistake. Say his name again for me.
Well, I have been pronouncing it Tuhin Chakrabarty, but I've heard other people pronounce it Tuhin. So I should have checked on that before we had
Well,
this.
okay,
I don't
that'll be
know.
fine. This
Karan, I
I'll
think he's
start with
from
that.
I think
Tuhin
he's from Delhi. I don't know how you would pronounce it.
I
Chakrabarty.
bet AI could do it better than any of us.
How would you guess it, Karan? Because
I don't know. I've never heard Tuhin as a first name. Chakrabarty is of course a Bengali last name, but which in Delhi I would say Chakrabarty, and Bengal they might say Chakrabarty. I mean,
Now I
it
think we're going to
depends.
leave all this in, by the way.
Keep it.
Well, anyway, he is trying to fine-tune artificial intelligence to produce better writing. And I wondered if you could just walk us through what he did, starting with his test using Han Kang's work.
Yes. So what he did was he took this AI model from OpenAI called GPT-4, which is one of the models that had been underlying ChatGPT, and he fine-tuned it, which means he sort of like programmed it to work in a specific way. And what he did in the fine-tuning was he fed it almost all of Han Kang's work, chunked into these like 200, 300, 400 word sections. And then he had AI generate descriptions of each of those sections. So he had these pairings that were like a little bit of writing and a description of that writing. And then fed all that into the machine so that the machine, quote unquote, learned to pair a description of a piece of writing with that writing itself, obviously in this particular writer's style. What he then did was started to feed descriptions from Han Kang's work that he hadn't already fed it to the machine to see if it could generate text in the style of Han Kang based on those descriptions. And what he found himself, and then also after having some student writers read the work, was that a lot of people could not distinguish these AI generated imitations of Han Kang's work from imitations that had been written by fellow writing students.
So
I just want to say that I feel like the big flaw in this is having students read anything at all. But I'm just gonna, I'll come to that later.
I will say that many writers that I talked to in working on the story pinpointed like the one villain that they pinpointed in the whole situation was MFA writing students,
Yeah,
which I thought was so mean.
That's just the
they were all like, yeah, the
thing.
students must just have been bad readers and bad writers.
So Chakrabarty's next step was to train the AI on the work of 29 authors, including your friend Tony, who we've just been talking about, Junot Diaz and Sigrid Nunez. And you spoke to both of them, and they thought that the imitations that AI had produced were no good, even though these villainous creative writing graduate students like them. And you were not sure it was fair to expect the students to be able to tell the difference. So you asked Chakrabarty to train the model on your work and to let you compete against it. And I wonder if you would read a little bit from this part of the article.
Yes, I'd be happy to. To start, he fine-tuned a model on my published writing, much as he'd done in the formal experiment. Then I sent him 4 short excerpts from a novel that I'm currently writing. No one else had read these excerpts. They had never been published or circulated. There was no way that a large language model could have seen them before. The narrator of my novel in progress is an Indian American ex-journalist. She runs a nonprofit that publishes stories from immigrant and refugee women, but it's strapped for funding, so she courts an Indian American venture capitalist as a potential donor. Chakrabarty used an LLM to create content summaries of the excerpts I'd sent him. One representative sentence from a summary about the narrator's journaling habit explains, a pivotal memory is introduced. In 9th grade, the narrator's mother read this journal, an act seen as a profound betrayal. Finally, he gave the summaries to his fine-tuned model, and he asked it to compose passages, quote, in the style of Vauhini Vara. Going into all this, I was self-assured, even smug. I'd always felt that my style was original. Sorry, I need to take a sip of water. I'd always felt that my style was original, and more important, that my books were totally distinct from one another. I figured that even if the AI model could imitate my past books, it couldn't predict the style of the novel in progress. So when Chakrabarty sent me the AI-generated imitations, I was genuinely confused. Like Diaz and Nunez, I found lots of stylistic details, rhythm, verbiage, annoying. But the text produced by the model was eerily close to mine. Reading some of its lines next to my own, I couldn't remember which was which. Unlike Diaz or Nunez, I even preferred some of the doppelgangers versions. My style seemed to be more consistent across projects than I'd realized. I sent 4 passages to some readers who'd like my previous books. Maybe I'll skip the part where I'm like, you can try this too, right?
Sure.
Okay. I sent 4 passages to some readers who'd liked my previous books, explaining that half were mine and half were the models. I wanted them to guess which were which. The first of my readers to respond was Dana Moriello, my best friend from college. And the first of my readers to respond was Dana Moriello, my best friend from college and an accomplished tech entrepreneur. Truth, : this was terrifying, she wrote. I was so nervous that I would say that AI wrote something that you wrote and you would be insulted! ! Her anxiety, it turned out, was justified. She didn't get any of them right. Dana blamed this partly on her not being a writer. But of my 7 readers, none correctly identified more than half the passages. One of the last people I heard from was the novelist Karan Mahajan, a professor of literary arts at Brown University. He and I learned to write together in college, along with Tony Tulathimutte, and have been sharing drafts with each other ever since. He's among the most perceptive writers and readers I've met. Oof, this was really confusing and mind-melting, Karan wrote. Then he, too, misidentified all 4 excerpts.
All right, well, that's a way to put your friend on the spot there, I feel like. And then we actually have him on the show to humiliate him further. But it seems like that would be really hard to do. Karan, I mean, you obviously had misgivings about this, but could you talk about what it was like to read this writing and try to figure out what was and was not AI?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, we have to be clear about who's being humiliated here because, that's an open
Well, it's
question.
just as long as it's not me, I'm fine.
And also, that when someone calls you the most perceptive reader and writer, you've just done something really bad. Like that's just
Yeah,
like,
you're in trouble.
you have to, they have to say that. I'm I've thought about this in retrospect. Firstly, yeah, I spent time looking at them. I certainly examined them closely, and I got them all wrong. Um, but it's I have just to push back against the experiment a little bit. There's something obviously artificial about getting these paragraphs, right, where you're specifically hunting for clues about whether something is AI generated or not. I mean, I can imagine like getting a paragraph by Hemingway, who is a repetitive writer who also like has sometimes like to my mind like robotic rhythms and being like this is definitely AI generated, right? So I'm not sure like there
I
was
feel like
anything.
Islands in the Stream could be argued as a totally AI generated
Probably
Hemingway
was.
novel. It's like Hemingway imitating himself.
Yeah.
All right.
And so in Vahini's case, like those, I don't think it was specific to her. I think I would have maybe gotten these wrong by other people as well. And also, there's this added tricky, naughty thing that's going on in these excerpts, which is that they are actually partly about tech. So the language of tech is being deployed. There's like a woman is talking about like the ROI on artistic projects in a way that may or may not be humorous. There's people talking about, why they became tech entrepreneurs. So there's all that going on. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I essentially did what someone who teaches writing perhaps would do, which is that the stuff that seemed more detailed and more specific, I assumed was Vauhini's. And the stuff that seemed to speak more broadly about things, I assumed was AI generated. And it turns out I was wrong.
So, Wahini, you mentioned also that you weren't always able to find your own voice in these samples, and then Karan has misrecognized you. So, what was your reaction? Like, what was the conversation that followed this?
It's funny. This is actually the first time we're talking with our voices about it because we afterwards we emailed. I think there were a lot of like skull emojis and exclamation points involved, emailed and texted about it. Um, it was really funny because actually my friend Dana, the tech entrepreneur, she and Karan know each other. And she specifically flagged Karan. Like she was like you've got, I'm sure Karan's going to get way more of these correct because, not only has he also known you forever, but he's a writer and he teaches at Brown. So anyway, my point is that all of the humiliation here goes to Karan, not me. No, but yeah, I mean, what did it feel like? It's funny because on one level I was horrified, obviously. On another level, I was kind of fascinated. Like I found it kind of intellectually interesting, honestly, that a large language model could be fed all of my work and then given a description of my work and generate something that sounded passably like me. And I think it was less because it had to do largely with the fact that like I really pride myself on doing something new with every new project. So it was I could imagine that like if it had tried to imitate something that sounded like my first novel, it'd be able to because it had absorbed all of that writing. But it kind of hurt my sense of like my own originality compared to my own past work to see that it could actually imitate something in a book that I had not even published yet. And then the fact that it's interesting because I think I chose passages that I thought would be tricky for people. And so when I chose passages of my own to share with my readers, a couple of the passages that I chose of my own were passages that I myself thought like, these could potentially pass for AI. So in some ways, like the response made me think more deeply about my own work and made like I think as I continue to revise this novel, the fact that there's like this specter haunting me of people having already mistaken my work for AI, that's going to make me think critically about my own work and like challenge myself to do more to make my own work like not quote unquote sound like AI, which I think like in our sort of like common language or parlance really means like this sounds unoriginal or cliched or whatever, so in a way it has less to do with AI than like what we think of as good work, which is like original work that says something in a new way.
What
I
Karan's saying
mean,
about specificity is also interesting. I guess I hadn't really thought about this until this moment, but I had an experience relatively recently where someone wrote to me who teaches my work and was like, I teach your work and here I'm attaching papers by students who wrote about your work and I'm so proud of these students. And one of the students' papers had a citation from Brotherless Night where I like read the sentence and I was like, that sounds like me. And also, I don't know if I wrote that sentence because I don't remember that sentence. And then I ran a search in my PDF of the book and was like, I did not write that sentence. And then I like didn't write
Whoa.
back to the professor for a while because I didn't he was so, then he wrote to me again, and finally I caved and like wrote back to him, and I was like, I'm so sorry. I think that like this is maybe a thing that happened in your class that you didn't know about. Um,
Wow.
so, I mean, I think that's like a feeling sort of adjacent. And then I can also think of like moments when I have caught plagiarism. Like I went to college and then subsequently worked in an office with Ross Douthat, who also used to work for SparkNotes. And I had students who plagiarized from SparkNotes that Ross Douthat had written. And because I
Huh.
knew his work so well, like I caught them.
Oh, wow.
Um, but like I don't, now I'm sort of like, this is, I mean, today that probably wouldn't happen. Like it's like this voice, this thing, like we're so proud of our voices. And like this fine tuning is also about putting the entire body of work or close to the entire body of work, like the entirety of your voice into this machine. And then the voice is the thing that it is claiming to imitate really well. And like maybe it's doing it.
I get that. On the other hand, like I feel like my style changes all the time. And also there are some writers for whom I think style is super important and they spend a lot of time maybe even preening over it, like somebody like Cormac McCarthy, right? Spends a lot of time thinking about how his sentences sound and what his vocabulary he's using. And other writers, like, I don't feel like style is that crucial to them. It's like sort of like the story that they're telling is more important. Like if I thought about, I don't know, Karan, how you thought about your books, like if they think of them as style heavy or not. Like I feel like my first novel was style heavy. I was trying to imitate Cormac McCarthy and his sentences, and sort of like some of that comes into the book. And then my next book, I realized like, well, I can't tell that story that way. It's too overbearing, and it was much simpler. I don't know how an AI model would merge those two different approaches to style, and I assume that my approach to style will change in the next book that I write.
Yeah, it's a really good question about style because I think it tends to matter more to authors sometimes than readers. And I'll tell you why I'm saying that. Like, I can imagine two books by Vauhini, one that is written actually by her and one that is AI generated. And the one by Vauhini is, amazing in her voice, but maybe doesn't have a good plot, let's just say, for the sake of argument. And the other one is less voicey, but actually like delivers a series of events that are far more compelling, right? Um, maybe I'd go for that actually at the end of the day, right? Like maybe the slight reduction in style wouldn't bother me to the same extent, right? And you can always just say, oh, this is a work in which Vauhini has dialed down her style. Like obviously this happens with late style with most authors, right? A kind of distillation occurs. So I see this as being a thing we're going to have to deal with a lot moving forward. I don't see this going away. On the upside, I was thinking about how it would be if I was watching a Studio Ghibli film, for example, that had been partly AI generated. And I think that I wouldn't think of it as being that different than the kind of production that happens on a pop song, where there are certain things that, aren't can't actually be done with instruments that are kind of, subbed in later on. And maybe I wouldn't mind, and maybe the same would be true for a book. Like the ideal melding would be if Vauhini wrote a book and she was like, there's certain sections here that I don't particularly care for yet, and I'm gonna use AI to help me out. And at the end, I wouldn't know, and maybe I wouldn't care. So I'm curious what Vauhini would think of that too.
I mean, I think about that in the context of your work, Karan, which I think of as being like very stylish or work in which style is really important. And I think, I mean, at least in my reading of your work, this has always been the case, by the way, for the past like 20 years that I've been reading your work. But I think there's a really strong relationship between style and consciousness and the broader politics in which the narrative consciousness operates, and the relationship and the conversation that's taking place between the narrative consciousness and an imagined addressee is taking place. And so all of which is to say that, like, I think sometimes when we talk about style, we talk about it as if it's like this like component of writing that can be siloed and divorced from all the other components like plot or character or theme, when in fact the decisions we make about the kind of language to use, which is what we're talking about when we talk about style, are so intricately bound up with like narrative consciousness and like community consciousness and the broader politics of any story. So that feels relevant to point out too.
So one of Junot Diaz's objections to the AI imitation of his work was that, quote, his doppelganger's vernacular was geographically and historically incoherent. Specifically, he says it got an important bit of Spanish slang wrong. And then Vauhini, you likened the AI imitation of Diaz to OpenAI's CEO Sam Altman in a sombrero, which I thought was funny. And you both center Indian and Indian American characters in your fiction. So how does you've thought about this issue, obviously, in terms of your own work. How does AI fail on race? And is it possible and desirable to have Chakrabarty's style of fine-tuning address this?
Yeah, I mean, it was such an interesting conversation actually with Junot Diaz because there was this particular line that where the AI imitation of Junot Diaz to me like read as more rhythmic and interesting than the Junot Diaz version. So this is in the book. This is how you lose her. And Junot Diaz wrote, the only thing she warned you about that she swore she would never forgive was cheating. I'll put a machete in you, she promised. And then the AI version of that sentence, based on a description of the sentence, is she told you from the beginning that if you ever cheated on her, she would chop your little pito off. So I'd been studying Spanish for a couple. I have been studying Spanish for a couple of years in Madrid. Pito is a word for whistle, but they use like there's a more common word for whistle in Spain. So I'd never heard the word, so I had to Google it. And when I Googled it, it said that pito means whistle in a lot of places, especially in Latin America. And it's also slang for penis. And I was like, well, yeah, that sounds like something that Junot Diaz would say. Sure. So to me, I was like, well, this sounds authentic enough. And the funny thing was that, Junot Diaz speaks some Spanish, but he is a member of like a very specific community, which is like New Jersey Dominican diaspora, right? And so in his community and like in his consciousness, pito is not a word that is used or that would come to mind for him. So when I ran this by him, he was like, I don't even know what that means. And I explained that it was supposed to be slang for a dick. And he was like, yeah, I've never heard that. Which isn't to say like maybe there are some like Dominican New Jersey residents New Jersey residents from the Dominican diaspora who use pito, maybe not, I'm not sure, but Junot Diaz doesn't. And that's what feels most relevant here. I had this interesting conversation, actually, a text message conversation with Tuhin, one of the co-authors of the study, after the piece came out about that thing that Junot Diaz pointed out. And he was like, I've heard from other readers who keep pointing out that like pito totally is Spanish slang for penis in the Latin American diaspora, which, was a fair point. What it suggests is that like that's a legitimate use of Spanish slang in some context, but the point still stands that it's not Junot Diaz's use of Spanish, which feels very relevant.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it's a reminder that the problem with AI in some ways is not going to be at the generation end. It's going to be at the other end, which is that if you're someone who is a literary fiction writer, like the four of us are, and you don't and you write to understand why you're feeling certain things, and also to tell yourself things that you might be too afraid to speak out loud, right? That you can only put them on the page. Then you have very little incentive to want to use AI, right? Like I think that's when I always kind of stop myself, is that I'm just not interested. Like that's not why I became a fiction writer. However, if I were a much more commercial fiction writer, or if I were truly making a film for a studio or trying to generate the nth episode of like a never-ending TV show, I'm sure I would fall prey to that. But the Speedo thing is a reminder of that, which is that like for someone like Diaz, like mining his very specific experience in New Jersey, getting to the bottom of that is what drives his work. And so, he's not going to want to use it for that reason. though it could get good enough to even do it at some point. Maybe this Pito problem won't exist, because I think it's a little bit of a MacGuffin. Like in 5 years, it'll get the New Jersey slang, but it still won't change things.
Well,
I mean, and then there's this other, oh, sorry,
go ahead.
There's this other sort of related issue here too, which is that if you can imagine a world in which people, whether they're writers or not, are using AI models to generate things that are meant to be imitations of other writers, you can imagine a world in which we're flooded with all this text that's like supposed to be representative of certain cultural backgrounds or experiences, but actually isn't. And so there's this like false impression that gets developed in culture that, like, you know, New Jersey Dominican slang, for example, includes the word pito, right? When maybe it doesn't, or Junot Diaz's doesn't in any case. Another example that I think about a lot is like my dad's use of ChatGPT to edit his emails, where it'll turn his Indian English into American English. So almost implicitly suggesting that like that's the right way to communicate. And potentially, like, we can imagine a future in which that leads to a world in which like Indian English just gets marginalized and erased as people who speak and write in Indian English use these things to quote unquote, clean up their writing, but in fact end up turning their writing into writing that represents a different culture.
That's interesting because, like, you know, you can set your Siri voice or whatever, right? And like I've set mine to be a British guy because I like to, it's my chance to tell the Empire what to do. But you can also like set it to be, I think, a woman who speaks Indian English. And of course there's 10 gazillion kinds of Indian English. But so there's this way that it like people, I remember having a lot of conversations with people who are like, I'm so happy to see this recognized, this particular voice brought out. And it seems like some of what we're talking about is like, right, its audience. Like, is it Junot Diaz's voice if people think it's Junot Diaz's voice, if it represents certain qualities that we associate with him, like use of like slang or the colloquial, or like, I don't know, like sort of, you know, addressing sex in some way, or thinking about masculinity, or does it like require like an actual knowledge of his vocabulary? Like, how will AI track, like I'm going to learn new words. I'm super excited about it. I'm going to learn new words and then I'm going to use them. And the AI doesn't know what I'm going to learn. Like it doesn't know about my like patterns of acquisition. It can't predict those, I don't think. If it can, then I have like a whole different set of things I'm alarmed about. But like, right, some of what we're talking about is also the ways that narrative fiction, maybe even specifically American fiction, pushes readers and writers towards an individualistic way of thinking about the world. You know, is AI imitation of writers fitting into this pattern of like the writer is an individual genius and recreating an individual writer's voice is a threat to that? But Vauhini, in the essay, you also talk about another approach, which you connect to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and you talk a little bit about like a more collective way of thinking about literature. And you actually talk about him switching from writing in English to switching to writing in the language he grew up speaking first, which is, I think, Gikayu. Can you say a little bit more about this like imagined world of like AI teaching us a more collective way to think about literature?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had to think a lot to try to wrap my mind around what the kind of lesson was from this experience that I had having this AI model be trained on my work. And I have Ngugi wa Thiong'o's book like just sitting on my, actually, I was going to say on my desk, but it's not true. It's like on the floor next to my desk, because I'm always like picking it up and paging through it. I find it so wise. And there's this part of the book that I love where he talks about switching to his the language he grew up with in his writing, because he wanted to write with an audience, an addressee in mind who spoke that same language and didn't speak English. And when he published his first book in that language, it became this sensation in his community, and people would like, there would be these like quote unquote professional readers who would go to bars and like read his books aloud, because the language was traditionally an oral language. So they'd go to bars and read the book aloud, and then they would like stop reading when they ran out of their beer so that everybody would get the bartender to pour them another glass of beer so they would keep reading. And so it speaks, what I love about that is that it speaks to the way in which storytelling has traditionally been this communal experience in a way that feels really concrete. And the reason that matters, I think, is that when we ask these questions about like whether it matters that Junot Diaz is that a piece of text uses Junot Diaz's language or language that can like pass for Junot Diaz, I think like we're implicitly talking about the work in this sort of like American, European, capitalistic, individualistic way in which the question is basically like doesn't matter is almost like a question where we as readers are like positioned as consumers. Like, does it matter to us? Are we still going to enjoy it? Are we not? Whereas what I appreciate about the kind of post-colonial Ngugi wa Thiong'o framing is that it frames the meaningful thing less in terms of like, is this satisfying to us as readers? Is it not? Is it satisfying to us as writers? Is it not? And more, and makes the case that the thing that matters about literature is like neither the individual authorial experience nor the individual readerly experience, but rather like the actual fact of communication that's taking place among real people, and communication, again, that's like placed within a broader political context, like in Karan's forthcoming book, The Complex, which everybody should read. No, but seriously, like that book, you could tell an AI model to like write in the style of Karan Mahajan, but like that AI model simply would not be situated in the world in the way in which Karan is situated in the world, and in the sort of broader politics of the world. And that feels like the most important, the salient thing here, and a potential way to kind of think our way through this question about AI rather than thinking about it in like a functional way. Like, can it do the thing or can it not do the thing? Is it satisfying to us? Is it not satisfying?
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, I think Vauhini put it really well. I've been thinking about what it potentially means, obviously, and it does seem to me that of course, the ship has sailed for every other genre of writing. Like I was in India a week ago, not even a week ago, 4 days ago, and a friend of mine who used to read a couple of business books a month, and because he runs a business, now just puts his problems into AI and gets a few paragraphs. He showed me how I could generate like a really good workout routine for myself by putting in all my daily constraints, and
the
like,
how-to genre is going to take
yeah.
absolute
So and people
clubbing.
Yeah, my dad is writing articles using AI. People are sending emails, so I think that for me, but literary fiction, and I think this, I might disagree with Vauhini a little bit, which is that I think the post-colonial world has also gone in the direction of the individual when it comes to writing, because part of it is like the only way capitalism can differentiate or make a case for literary fiction is by making this case that there's like a solitary artist sitting behind the keyboard doing it, and that's true of the art market as well. But just like the art market was not destroyed by the advent of technology on the computer, which you could generate very high tech images with. I think what's going to happen is that you'll have novels published by Junot Diaz, but then you might have extensive, essentially fan fiction published on the voices of someone,
Which
and that
exists
already exists. Right, already
Yeah.
exists, but it'll be possible to do it for literary fiction. It's possible one of the fan fiction franchises will take on a life of its own and become a bestseller, especially in a place like I feel like, again, I don't know why. I mean, I think where places where the general education level is lower, but that's not even necessarily true. Even here, people just aren't going to worry too much about that difference, right? Like they're just going to say like, I'm enjoying this. Move on. Like you guys can sit in your Zoom rooms and agitate about this, but it's over.
I wonder what's going to happen to like piracy. I think about stuff like Z Library, or there are people who are going to great lengths to like get the authentic versions of things that they normally don't have. They don't have quote unquote legitimate access to. Like what's going to happen to those? But yeah, I mean, I don't know. Maybe they'll be populated with AI versions of us. I also want to pause and say that I definitely pronounced the name of the language that Ngugi wa Thiong'o was working in incorrectly, and I'm not sure I'm going to do much better now, but it looks to me like I should have said Gikuyu. Um, and I feel like the fact that I don't know how to do this is like also a pretty good example of the ways in which all of this conversation is, yeah, I mean, tilted to English. A lot of it is very Anglophone.
Can I just add
I
one
want to,
thing before?
yeah,
Just
please go
one,
ahead.
which is that coming back to that fan fiction point, what I wanted to say is that in some ways is a better way of looking at Vauhini's excerpt because each of us carries like an image of what we think their writer friends do extremely well. And for Vauhini does everything extremely well. But to me, the thing that I'm always impressed by because I struggle with it is like there's like a kind of extraordinary emotional openness. Like this is true of whether in Searches or in The Immortal King Rao. And it's like no matter what the character is, like this is you just feel like this is a very vulnerable space the character is occupying and telling a story from. And I thought the AI did a good job of
Hmm.
imitating that sort of openness. I said that in my email about the excerpt where there's a kid talking about imitating a cat because he misses being young. And there's this great line like Kay peered down at his knees in the way someone would if they had seen them for the first time. And there was a reference to a sister, which is something that Vauhini has in often in her fiction. So I'm struck by that like it can not so much style even that it could get to like an emotional register that seemed closer to Vauhini. So yeah, I mean, I guess there'll be Vauhini fan fiction soon.
As long as I get like royalties from that.
You
No,
won't.
just
You won't.
joking. Not
Well, maybe
don't
I was
endorse.
thinking about when you guys were talking about this, like maybe, and we're not going to talk, we don't have room to talk about this right now, but surveillance and the way that, that AI is going to be operating in terms of surveilling people in who are dissidents or speak against the administrations of various countries, including ours. It may come to a point where people want to use the oral tradition, that it's valuable to tell
Yeah.
stories that are not digitized anywhere, right? And that gives them a certain kind of power. I just wanted to point that out there. The question that I wanted to ask is, we focus on style, and Karan was just talking about emotional register, okay, but what about plot, and what about character development or the invention of characters, right? I mean, that is a true, or conceptual breakthroughs of a story, like Kafka's In the Penal Colony. Like what happens there is not predictive, right? I don't think like or the ghost in Beloved, or the way that time works in Pedro Paramo, or something like that. I don't, those were conceptual breakthroughs that are very individual to the artist that like they didn't know they were going to do. They weren't necessarily predicted in their prior work. I don't see exactly how I can see how an LLM can imitate the way someone sounds, right? But to me, that's not as important as what they're doing on the page with that sound. Am I wrong about this?
I will say that the authors of the study that I wrote about acknowledged that there are all these things that their research doesn't show, right? Like, so their research doesn't show AI models being able to generate something at any significant length, more than a couple of hundred words, right? That imitates an author's style, certainly not a whole book. Things like idea generation, there are all these things that like maybe an AI model could hypothetically do, but the research I wrote about here is actually is somewhat narrow. So I think you're right to point out, Whitney, that there are all these elements involved in writing a piece of work, whether it's a full length book or not.
Like you could
That
imitate a novel
you have to put
structured like
together.
Cloud Atlas, but only after it's been published, right? Only after that idea has been put there.
But to play devil's advocate, I mean, how many friends do you, we're all writers, how many friends do you all have who have like great ideas, like legitimately great ideas for books or stories all the time that they'll like come to us with, being like, hey, you should write about this. What if that friend who doesn't consider themselves a writer could put their legitimately great idea into some model and then generate like text that reads as more literary than what they might otherwise be able to produce, right? To fit their great idea. I mean,
Oh, wait, I have a very strong opinion about this. Can I respond?
Sure.
So, I mean, for me, I don't ever have great ideas going into writing a book. And I think Karen was talking about this a little bit earlier. Like, you get ideas while you're writing. And I actually think that the way that you generate new ideas is that the first ideas that come to me when I'm writing a novel are a collection of crappy ideas from bad narrative that I've watched in television or whatever. And the writing of the novel is trying to find your way to a new idea, right? And so I don't know that I could ever state to an LLM, "Hey, I got this new idea," and my new idea at the beginning of the book would suck. Maybe there's other people who have, but most of the people who come to me with great ideas for books are not the ideas are not that great.
Have Karan or Whitney, I'm not sure if this is what you mean, but I have over the years had a number of people approach me and be like, I have a great idea for a book you should write. And I'm always like, God bless you. I also have ideas for books that I'm going to write. And so I actually can't take yours on board. I encourage you to write it yourself or to contact someone else. And sometimes those ideas are very good. Sometimes they even come out as books later. And like there was a specific ship that was in Canada that involved like a lot of Tamil refugees coming from Sri Lanka, and someone like when that ship was it was sort of stuck in administrative limbo, and someone wrote to me and was like, you should write about the MV Sunsea. And just like I can imagine that person, instead of writing me, goes into the LLM and is like, I'd like to write a work of literary fiction about the MV Sunsea in a combination of the styles of Karan Mahajan, Vauhini Vara, and V Ganeshananthan, with a dash of Whitney Terrell. And like, I don't know what that cocktail sounds like, but like maybe is that what you're talking about? Like the kind of like people kind of, instead of like taking their ideas that have to do with the news or something that they like the tagline of this show is, anything that you see in the news has already happened in literature. And like, I do feel like oftentimes people see something in the news, they're like, that would make a great book. And they want us to write
like
them.
People's stories from their lives. Like I'm always fascinated by like the stories I hear from other people. Like so many interesting conversations with Uber drivers, about like the stories of their lives, where I'm like, that would genuinely be an excellent book, but they don't identify as writers, so they're not going to write it.
And also I can, coming back to this question of characters that was raised earlier, you can imagine taking the book that Sugi just described and saying, okay, AI, examine these four faces who are in conversation on this Zoom screen and their tics, verbal patterns, what you guess their personalities are. And then you have real, live people as stand-ins for characters, and then it doesn't have to do the legwork or the grunt work of relying on stock characters or cliches. So this conversation has taken a very different route for me. I feel like I'm getting closer to understanding how I can, just become a fully AI generated writer.
Vauhini and Karan, thank you so much for joining us. Listeners, don't miss Searches and Vauhini's other work, and be on the lookout for Karan's new novel, The Complex, as has been mentioned, coming to bookstores soon.